The American people do not want war.
Obviously, Maduro is bad, yada, yada.
I mean, ask the Taliban. Navy SEALs were swept away by the ocean. Germany, what? They're going to relive their Nazi past. I hate their Nazi affiliations.
When I think about the Russia-Ukraine conflict, I think the best analogy from Hollywood that I could choose are the Rocky movies.
I've boxed. But one of the things I learned about boxing is that if you have two qualified boxers, the guy that tries to throw the knockout blow actually opens himself up for a counter punch.
Hello, everyone. This is the New Rules Podcast, and I'm your host, Dimitri Simes Jr. It's been a while since we've talked on camera, but we are back. We are going to be recording regular episodes. And what better way to restart the show than to welcome our longtime friend, Scott Ritter.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
Yeah. So, Scott, I definitely want to talk about Ukraine because there's a lot of developments, but I want to start off with Venezuela. Because over the past few weeks, we've seen U.S. troops and, bombers and ships amass near Venezuela. We've seen Trump make open threats of regime change. But it seems like there has been some backpedaling in just the past several days where Trump is saying that, look, obviously Maduro is bad, yada, yada, but we're open for negotiation. What do you make of the U.S. military buildup around Venezuela? What does the end goal look like?
Well, first of all, it's a very serious situation. Anytime you have a power like the United States threatening to wage war against a lesser power, you have to take the threat seriously. But when we speak of attacking Venezuela, people are focused on the conventional military aspect because of the drama of the movement of ships and airplanes, et cetera. I just want to remind people that sending a dozen F-35 airplanes does not an air campaign make. Flying two B-52s around the border of Venezuela does not an air campaign make. The strategic air campaign that we waged against Iraq during the Gulf War involved thousands of airplanes over a sustained period of time.
And Venezuela is larger than Iraq.
It is larger and more complicated than Iraq. The same thing with ground troops. The Gulf War in 1991 was waged by over 700,000 American troops. Even the smaller scale Operation Iraqi Freedom in 2003 involved close to 200,000 American troops. We have 4,000 Marines off the coast of Venezuela. Now, I'm a former Marine, and I think highly of the capabilities of my fellow Marines, but 4,000 Marines is not going to alter the strategic balance when Venezuela has millions of militiamen, tens of thousands of highly trained regular armed forces. So it's a lot of posturing, I believe, designed to create pressure on the Maduro government, while the CIA does the most important work, which is attempting to develop paramilitary capabilities outside and inside Venezuela that can be used to foment a coup d'etat, to develop a political opposition that could possibly step in and replace Maduro. And I think that's where the primary focus of effort is. That doesn't mean that the military can't be used. We have strategic strike capacity that could be used. Again, I'll give you an example from Iraq. Since Iraq was a bad idea and Venezuela would be a bad idea, it's pretty cool to be able to compare bad ideas. In December of 1998, the United States carried out Operation Desert Fox, a 72-hour bombing campaign. The targets we struck were almost exclusively related to the security of Saddam Hussein. The purpose of the strikes was to suppress Saddam's ability to secure his regime and provide opportunities for military units that the CIA had been trying to recruit to move in on Baghdad and remove Saddam Hussein. It was a smaller scale than, say, Desert Storm or the future Operation Iraqi Freedom. It was tailor-made for a coup to back a coup that never happened because Saddam's regime was able to detect it and deter it. I'm thinking that when we speak of Venezuela, the United States would be looking to carry out a similar action, very concerted military action to suppress the security regime around Maduro so that a coup could take place to replace him. That seems to be the most likely scenario at this juncture. There's a couple problems with this, though. Donald Trump ran on a platform of peace. His voters are holding him to this issue. The American people do not want war. And we definitely don't want a war with a neighboring country that could generate a massive migration crisis where refugees now in a country whose society has collapsed, whose economy has collapsed, are now fleeing the country. And where are they going to go? North to the United States. We have an immigration crisis. We don't need to be fueling it with a war that we don't need to fight. Two, we have a history of being able to remove regimes from power. We're very good at killing people. I mean, ask Gaddafi, ask Saddam. We're good at removing people, ask Assad. But what we're not good at is finishing the job. And Donald Trump ran on a platform that said, we need to stop getting ourselves involved in failed military adventures that take decades and consume trillions of dollars. And yet he's preparing to do just that in Venezuela. There was a shock in the polls a week or so ago when we saw the Republicans lose across the board. They lost in Virginia, they lost in New Jersey, they lost New York City to a radical, communist even. This sent a shot across the bow of Donald Trump. He has important midterm elections coming up. And he has to ensure that he doesn't lose his political base. He has economic difficulties. He doesn't need to compound those by getting us involved in the very kind of war that he promised the American people we would never get involved in again.
So it seems like there's two main options, right? There's either this is gunboat diplomacy meant to intimidate Maduro and force him to make significant concessions, or if that doesn't work out, basically try to carry out a decapitation strike that sets the stage for regime change.
Yeah, and unfortunately, given the recent history of the United States, it might be that our efforts at diplomacy are just subterfuge. Look what happened with Iran. We told the Iranians we're ready to engage in detailed talks about their nuclear program. We even scheduled a date when we would have these meetings. And yet, 2 days before the meetings, the United States assisted Israel in carrying out a decapitation strike against the Iranian regime. We have openly bragged about the role, Donald Trump has bragged about the role we played in decapitating Hezbollah and Hassan Nasrallah. So we have a history of saying we want diplomacy, and then we betray the very concept of diplomacy through perfidy. I mean, it's a war crime. Perfidy is a war crime. When you bring out the white flag and say you want a truce, and the enemy comes out to talk to you and you kill the enemy, that's a crime of perfidy. And that's what we did against Hezbollah. That's what we've done against Iran. And I think that's probably what we'll do against Maduro. Maduro should be very careful when Donald Trump says, I want to have talks with you. Because what he's probably doing is setting Maduro up to let his guard down, and then we'll kill him.
So, you compared you said that Venezuela would be an even worse idea than going into Iraq. Let me play devil's advocate. Let me put on my neocon cap, right?
Good Lord.
Yeah. So if I were a neocon and I were looking at this, I would say look, it doesn't have to be like Iraq, because you can, for example, look at what happened in Grenada or Panama in the 1980s, where basically the United States went in, kicked ass, and left without so much as a scratch on it. Mm-hmm. And I would argue that, look, Venezuela could very well be similar because, Maduro and the current government is reportedly unpopular. There's a viable opposition in place in the form of the lady who won the Nobel Prize. If she, for whatever reason, declines, we could always cargo lift Juan Guaido out of Miami, airdrop him. But This isn't a sort of situation where, like Iraq, where Saddam Hussein, you get rid of him and just everything collapses. I guess, why is Venezuela a fundamentally different and more dangerous proposition than, let's say, Grenada or Panama?
Well, first of all, Grenada was an extraordinarily small island. If the United States of America can't steamroll an island with a minuscule army, with a handful of Cuban military engineers trying to build an airfield, then what? And it didn't go very well for us. We lost a lot of guys for stupidity. Navy SEALs were swept away by the ocean. Delta Force launched a number of attacks that were failures. The Army attacks stalled. After the paratroopers landed. The only people that actually performed well were the Marines. But even then, we lost a helicopter getting shot down by a nation that was really not equipped to face a superpower. I don't think we should be using Grenada as a symbol of American military strength and prowess. Panama. Well, geez, we occupied Panama. We had a military contingent already in place in Panama. It's not like we had to actually invade Panama. We just had to move off our base. We controlled Panama. The CIA had been actively involved in Panama, undermining the regime of Manuel Noriega. And again, things went very bad. Look at the SEAL attack on Noriega's private airplane and how many SEALs we lost. Delta Force's effort to rescue, a CIA agent that it was being held. We lost a helicopter, a number of people were wounded, and we ended up massacring a lot of Panamanians. It was a very bloody affair to topple a man that we propped up for so many years. He was an ally. I wouldn't call Panama the shining example of American military prowess. We don't have a military contingent in Venezuela. The CIA has been trying and failing for decades to overthrow either Chavez or Maduro. The Venezuelan military is very capable. It has the support of Russia. It has the support of Cuba, Nicaragua, China. The idea that this is going to be a walk in the park is absurd. And I would be careful about thinking that Maduro is unpopular. We have a tendency in the West to exaggerate the capabilities of the opposition. This lady who won the Nobel Peace Prize, who's one of the greatest warmongers ever, promoting the actual destruction of her country, how does that qualify you for a Peace Prize? I don't know. She's not popular. She's not going to be a popular leader. She will always be seen as a tool of the imperial West, as a tool of the CIA, as a tool of the United States. And if we do remove Maduro and put her in place, all we guarantee is popular unrest for decades. And as I said, the United States is very good at removing people from power. We're not very good at winning the game. Venezuela is a game we will not win. And the irony is, why are we going after them? We know it's not about drugs. Jim Story, the State Department official who was the former number 2 at the U.S. Embassy in Caracas, who then went to Colombia when the embassy left and set up the Venezuelan, embassy in exile, so to speak. He ran the covert operations. He organized repeated coup attempts against Maduro in the first Trump administration. He recently has come out and said that this hyping about the drugs, about Maduro's link to narco trafficking, et cetera, is just pure fiction. Pure fiction. Maduro's not doing that. This is about oil. This is about resources. And look, however this plays out, drugs in Venezuela are going to become like weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Just a lie being used to justify a war. But we don't need to go to war if it's about resources. Maduro today is willing to allow the United States into Venezuela and manage Venezuela's oil production to the benefit of both Venezuela and the United States exclusively. So this is not so much about resources even, because we could get answers. This is about pride. This is Marco Rubio's war. Marco Rubio, when he was elected to the Senate, was, an anti-communist Cuban American who immediately turned his eyes on Venezuela and in 2016 started articulating, when he got his seat on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee responsible for the Western Hemisphere, started to articulate the absolute need to militarize this, for the American military to get involved. And for nearly a decade now, he's been advocating for this. Now he's the Secretary of State and the National Security Advisor combined in one. Unprecedented power, not seen since Henry Kissinger in the 1970s. And this is Marco Rubio's war. He's the one pushing this because he sees this conflict as his gateway to the presidency. Marco Rubio is not satisfied with being the Secretary of State. He's already run for president against Donald Trump. He hates Donald Trump. Just go back and look at the rhetoric from the campaigns. He despises Donald Trump. He was bought and paid for by Miriam Adelson, who gave Donald Trump $100 million to put Marco Rubio into the government. And Marco Rubio today is seeking to use the Venezuela conflict as the way to leap over J.D. Vance to become the next president of the United States.
And interestingly enough, there have been some leaks recently that apparently a group of neocon senators, donors, were lobbying specifically Trump to pick Marco Rubio as VP over J.D. Vance.
But Donald Trump hates Marco Rubio. I remember little Marco. They don't like each other. They don't respect each other.
Then why is he Secretary of State and National Security Advisor?
Because Miriam Adelson gave Donald Trump $100 million.
Fair enough. You said something that I think is going to draw a lot of attention, and I know this because I've gotten flack for saying the same thing, but only, in a softer way. You said that the Venezuelan military is quite capable and that they're not going to be just steamrolled. Now, when you look at a lot of the discourse, people seem to think that the Venezuelan military is something akin to Saddam Hussein's Republican Guard that fled at first sight, or the Syrian Arab Army that last year also fled upon first contact. That basically, if you send in some B-52 bombers and you hit some sensitive targets, the whole thing will just come crashing down. But even if it doesn't come crashing down, the United States is so much technologically superior to whatever Venezuela has that the Venezuelan military won't be able to do a single thing to stop the U.S. Is that a fair assessment? Why or why not?
Well, first of all, I'm just going to push back on the concept of the Iraqi Republican Guard running at first sight. I fought in a war against them. They didn't run. They fought. They died. But these are some of the bravest soldiers I ever saw in combat. They were facing a technologically superior enemy who had air supremacy, and they stood their ground. They sought to engage. Ask the people that fought in the Battle of, I think it was 173 Easting against the Talwalkana Division. They didn't run. They kept coming. They kept coming. They kept coming. They're not cowards. They were very brave. They stood their ground. They fought. The Medina Division fought. The Talwalkana fought. The Hammurabi fought. And this is in the Gulf War. In the 2003 war, they likewise fought. They didn't run. There was no running in these people. They died in place, fighting a technologically superior enemy. It's wide open desert, which gave air power a lot of opportunities. Look at the map of Venezuela. How much desert is in Venezuela? Not too much. Probably none. A lot of jungle. You know who else fought us in the jungle? The Viet Cong, the North Vietnamese. Go back and read the histories of the Vietnam War. The Viet Cong didn't run. The North Vietnamese didn't run. They stood and they fought. And it cost us a lot to dig them out, and we ultimately lost that war, even though we had B-52 bombers pounding the hell out of that country. F-100 fighters coming in, dropping napalm. F-4 bombers coming in, dropping 250, 500-pound bombs. We didn't win. So anybody who thinks that we're going to steamroll the Venezuelans probably don't know anything about Venezuela. There's a lot of national pride there. And their soldiers are very professional. They train very hard, and they are very loyal, not just to Maduro and the government, but to Venezuela. They love their country. And when the gringo decides to come in, they're not going to just stand aside and say, welcome. They're going to fight. Maybe they'll die, but they're not going to run. They're going to stand and fight And it's going to be young Marines that once again have to close with and destroy the enemy through firepower maneuver, who are going to be absorbing the bullets in their body as they have to do a job that should never be asked of them, to invade a sovereign nation, to wage war against a sovereign people.
But, to kind of dig deeper on the air supremacy point, why can't the U.S. just send in B-52 bombers, severely wound Venezuela and call it victory? Why isn't it just sufficient to overwhelm Venezuela with U.S. air power?
Air power just blows things up. I mean, ask the Taliban. B-52s, B-1s were flying over Afghanistan, no air defense. Anytime the Taliban's heads snuck up out of the desert, bam, 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 they got bombed, they were slaughtered, they were killed. Who controls Afghanistan today? The B-52 or the Taliban? Okay, this air power doesn't win anything. Air power kills people, it destroys things. Boots on the ground is what wins a war. And when you're fighting an enemy who's defending their territory, defending their land, defending their culture, defending their history, defending their legacy, defending their families, you got to go in and you got to root them out. And at the end of the day, they are more willing to die to defend their country than we are to die taking their country. And ultimately what happens in the United States, although we may win every tactical engagement, I'm going to tell you right now, nobody's going to beat a Marine Corps Rifle Company. All right? When the Marine Corps Rifle Company closes with the enemy, we will destroy the enemy. But then we're left with the ground with dead bodies. The enemy disappears further into the jungle. We've lost some Marines. We regroup and we pursue. We engage them again. We kill them because we're better. We're better trained. We're the elite. But we lost more Marines. They flee deeper into the jungle. And we keep going. It's an endless, endless struggle. And behind us, the enemy filters back in. And we have to fight for that terrain all over again. That's what happened in Vietnam. That's what would happen in Venezuela. Yeah, we'll win every tactical engagement. The B-52s will kill a lot of people, blow up a lot of stuff. But at the end of the day, it'll be the Venezuelan people, their military, their militia that'll be holding the ground.
Yeah, and I mean, to kind of elaborate on that point, based on the reports that we're seeing, the United States is deploying around 10,000 troops near Venezuela, about 2,000 of which are U.S. Marines. That obviously isn't enough to occupy a country like Venezuela. But what sort of specific military objectives could such a force realistically accomplish?
Well, first of all, of that 10,000, the vast majority of them are sailors on ships. So they're not leaving their ships. They're staying on the ships to do that. The ships, though, have significant strike capacity, Tomahawk missiles. The aircraft carrier, Gerald Ford, obviously has an embarked air wing. And then we have other military assets, F-35 fighters that are deployed to Puerto Rico. And I guess now we're talking about further deploying in the region into Trinidad and Tobago. We can carry out a handful of precision strikes, similar to what we did in Iraq in 1998, Operation Desert Fox. We can fire hundreds of millions of dollars worth of cruise missiles into buildings that will probably be empty. We can drop bombs on targets that may be there, may not be there by the time we drop the bombs on them. But even if we blow up those targets, the Venezuelans have more equipment than we have bombs. What we can do is try to create instability, to try and destabilize the Maduro regime, to strike headquarters, to strike communications. The Marines can do limited incursions. We can seize a building. We can seize an airfield. We can seize a port. We won't be able to hold it too long because 2,000 Marines, it doesn't matter how good they are, there's just 2,000 of them. You'd have to have follow-on forces coming in. But what we could do is start something that then maybe the CIA has a plan for a coup, having the Venezuelan military change sides and fight on behalf of this Nobel Peace Prizing, a warmongering woman. But history has shown that that's not it. We expected Iraqi divisions south of Baghdad in Operation Desert Fox to leave their barracks and move to Baghdad after we bombed Saddam's Special Republican Guard. But they didn't. The generals who the CIA thought were going to do this, said, no, we're Iraqi patriots. We're not playing this game. The generals that said, we'll play that game were arrested and murdered or executed by Saddam Hussein's people. That's the fate of any Venezuelan who thinks they're going to betray Venezuela today. Venezuela is a patriotic country. There is no room for traitors.
Beyond Venezuela, what broader consequences of a U.S. attack / U.S. invasion of Venezuela, what would be the broader consequences for the U.S. relations with the rest of Latin America?
Well, first of all, Colombia today is on the side of Venezuela. So this war could rapidly turn into a war between Colombia, Venezuela, and the United States. Cuba is supporting Venezuela. And if the United States gets bogged down in Venezuela, Cuba could become an important factor. Nicaragua, likewise, is supporting Venezuela. Brazil, this could lead to instability in Brazil. This could lead to instability in Guyana. It could lead to instability throughout the southern hemisphere, South America, Central America. I don't think Americans realize that we have lost our status of being the good guys. I mean, we maybe never were the good guys when it comes to South America. We were always the imperialists. I mean, we have a bad track record. Pinochet, Allende. We kill populist leaders. We promote dictators. But we've always had the overwhelming economic influence that translates into diplomatic pressure that can be applied. Today, you have BRICS. Brazil is a member of BRICS, which is an alternative multilateral approach to global economic relations. Argentina was invited, but they have a unique president who opted out. But that doesn't mean that the Argentinian people aren't looking for multilateral opportunities, especially today when we see the Argentinian economy collapsing because of the extremist policies of Milei. Chile, likewise, can see economic pressures. You go to Peru, you go to Ecuador, all of these nations have lingering resentment towards imperial America. And what we could be doing is igniting a firestorm of anti-American posturing in South America that then translates into Central America. I mean, Mexico's not our biggest fan. We're talking about waging war against the cartels in Mexico, which is a violation of Mexican sovereignty. We insult their president on a daily basis, and we undermine their economy. We could see Mexico turn from being a friendly neighbor into being a hostile neighbor, which create even more border insecurity. So this could go very bad, not just about making Venezuela the next Vietnam or the next Afghanistan, but making the entire region shift from being, the foundation of a Monroe Doctrine 2.0, which is what the Trump administration is pursuing today. We talk about Fortress America, where we're going to retreat from the Middle East, from the Pacific, from Europe, and build this Fortress America. But it's not much of a fortress if South America and Central America are rising up against the American hegemon. So this could go very bad, very fast.
And on that chaotic note, let's shift to Russia, Ukraine.
An easier problem.
Yeah, an easier nut to crack, yeah. Right now, the main news, obviously, is the crumbling of Ukrainian defenses around Pokrovsk and Mirnograd in the Donetsk region, and the crumbling of their defenses near Kupiansk in the Kharkov region. Now, the big debate online is, to what extent is this actually a big deal? So I'd be interested in hearing what your assessment is and what you think comes next after this.
I hesitate to put too much emphasis on a single battle. If you recall Bakhmut, the Battle of Bakhmut, that was the end all. That was the battle that the meat grinder at Bakhmut, grinding everybody down. Russia won, a great loss. Ukraine lost. They lost everything. 60,000 strong reserves were thrown away in Bakhmut. But after the battle ended, the line stabilized, and there hasn't been tremendous surge forward at that time, because Ukraine had, people tend to forget this, from 2015, until the special military operation began in 2022, Ukraine had turned this area of Donetsk, of the Donbass, into a fortified heartland. I'm talking about defenses in depth.
Even more so than, let's say, what Hamas did in Gaza.
100% or more than what Hezbollah did in southern Lebanon. What Ukraine did in building these defenses is make this impregnable foundation of military power that they planned on using as a launching pad to complete the reconquest of Donbass, to throw out the pro-Russian separatists, et cetera. That's what triggered the war. A lot of people don't remember how in the weeks leading up to the special military operation, how Ukraine poured 60,000 troops into the region. They began intensive artillery bombardments, and they had a plan to initiate an offensive to drive out the separatists in March of 2022. The Russians carried out a preemptive strike, which is legal under the principles of Article 51 of the United Nations Charter, preemptive self-defense. Russia, of course, engaged in a collective security arrangement with the Lugansk People's Republic and the Donetsk People's Republic, which has a precedent in this action. It was, after all, the United States and NATO that created a collective security arrangement to justify their invasion and occupation of Kosovo. So what's good for the goose, should be good for the gander. But the point is, Pokrovsk was the logistical and command and control hub for this defense, especially in this sector of Donetsk. Behind Pokrovsk, there's nothing. Pokrovsk is the final, bolt that held that fortress area together. If Pokrovsk falls, and it is falling, there's almost a straight shot to the Dnieper River with nothing but flat farmland. Yes, that's ideal for drone warfare, but there is no Pokrovsk left to launch the drones from. I'm not saying that it's going to make it easy. The Russians aren't just going to go in. Russia's waging a war of attrition, and that's what people need to understand. This isn't about territorial advancement, big red arrows. It's about killing Ukrainians, straight up. This is about depleting Ukraine's manpower. And Russia's doing this in spades. On Russia's worst day, the casualty ratios are 1 to 3, meaning for every dead Russian, there's 3 dead Ukrainians. On Russia's best day, the casualty ratios are 1 to 12, 1 to 20, or even more, because of the domination that Russia has on the battlefield. Russia's job isn't to give Ukrainians the opportunity to kill Russian soldiers. Russia's job is to kill the Ukrainians, to deplete their manpower, to make it impossible for Ukraine to sustain cohesive defense on a 1,000-kilometer front line. And Russia's succeeding in this. Everybody says, well, then when will the Ukrainians collapse? The answer is when they run out of manpower. And as long as Ukraine and NATO are willing to fight to the last Ukrainian, this could be a while yet.
Again, let me put on my devil's advocate cap.
Your Ben Hodges cap.
Imagine I'm, a highly respected former U.S. general like Ben Hodges or Philip Breedlove, someone who gives expert commentary on CNN, MSNBC, other highly respectable news outlets. And they've looked at this war of attrition strategy, and they've looked at the Russian advances, and they say, they look pretty lackluster. The reason Russians aren't making big gains is not because they're playing four-dimensional chess, but because the Ukrainians have such robust defenses. Even though they have shortages of manpower, they've created this super impressive drone wall that helps close the gap. And that at this rate, it'll take, Russia 100 years to reach Kiev at the current pace that they're going. What sort of flaw do you find with that logic? What flaw do you see with that argument? Why isn't it a legitimate critique?
Well, I'll give them full credit. Look, let's never once denigrate the fighting capabilities of the Ukrainian armed forces. You won't find a single Russian who fights them that says, oh, they're horrible, they're weak, they can't fight. The Ukrainians are putting up a hell of a fight. There's no doubt about that. Drones, I just had a dinner with a Russian drone commander on the front line, and I asked him the question, who's better at drone warfare, Russia or Ukraine? He said, right now, Ukraine. They're very good at what they do. The problem is sustainability. Again, Amateurs talk tactics, professionals talk logistics. It's about sustainability. The Ukrainians are able, and they've shown this capability, to surge a tremendous amount of drone capability, the drone wall, you call it, into a specific region. And it's hell on earth for the Russian soldiers that are involved in that. You've seen the videos where they're using up to 5 drones for one Russian soldier to hunt them down and kill them. It's a bad day for the Russians when that happens. But then Russia is able to stabilize the front, bring in its own capabilities, and they start to attack not just the drones, but the people operating the drones. The most dangerous job in the war today for the Ukrainians is to be a frontline drone operator, because eventually the Russians will find you and they will kill you. And then when they kill you, you're no longer flying your drones, the drone wall collapses, and Russia surges its capability back in place and begins the very difficult job of digging the Ukrainians out of the ground. This is a very, very hard war. But the flaw there is that the Hodges and company, Breedlove, is they're looking at a map and they're measuring the gains. And they say, Russia's only advanced just this much. At this continued rate of advance, it'll take Russia forever to achieve its objectives. What they're failing to realize is that the advances are measured not in terrain captured, but Ukrainians killed. The Ukrainians cannot replace the casualties that they've lost. And so what will happen is eventually the Ukrainians will lose the ability to sustain cohesive defense on the front line, and then the real collapse will begin. And at that point in time, Hodges and Breedlove will have to look at the map and acknowledge the error of their ways, because you will see rapid Russian advances at that time when the Ukrainians are no longer able to retain defensive cohesion. But while they can retain defensive cohesion, what does that mean, defensive cohesion? It means the Ukrainians have command and control, they have logistics, they have fire support, they have artillery that's able to fire on the Russians, they have drones, they have air power, they still are able to, Ukraine has all the tools available to it. And despite the fact of all the tools available to it, to include hundreds of billions of dollars of NATO's best equipment, the Russians continue to advance. That's one thing that Hodges and Breedlove tend to forget, is that no matter what we do with Ukraine, they're losing. And it's not just that they're losing territory, strategic objectives. This army that NATO has built is being destroyed. Ukraine has shown an ability to reinforce, to recruit new members, but the training becomes very poor. There's such a need for manpower that they're literally pulling people off the streets, giving them a week or so of training, throwing them to the front line where they either get killed, they get wounded, or they get captured, or they surrender. It's buying time. Eventually, they're going to run out of these resources. The best Ukrainian units right now are trapped in Pokrovsk and Kupiansk. The 25th Brigade, they're all going to die. The 38th Marine Brigade, their history. Azov is supposedly in trouble in Kupiansk. I don't think any of them are going to be captured by the Russians, and they're not going to get out. So when these people die, these are the best of the best. These are the best fighters Ukraine has. There's no good fighters left to replace them. These are irreplaceable losses. And so what you'll have is poorly trained territorial brigades who will be used to plug the line, but they lack the skill set necessary to survive in modern combat, and they'll be slaughtered. And at some point in time, there just won't be any Ukrainians left to fight the war. Russia, meanwhile, is able to recruit more than enough manpower to replace combat losses, but more importantly, that allows them to accrue reserve strength. So Russia has a lot of flexibility. They can rotate their units in and out of combat more effectively, so the troops that are fighting are fresh, trained, motivated. The Ukrainians, once they get to the front line, they can't do the rotation. So these troops are online in contact for a very long period of time. They're exhausted, demoralized, and that makes them far less effective. The Russians have all of the advantages. The Ukrainians are well-trained, well-equipped, and they fight like hell, but there's just not enough of them.
And it's become fashionable to compare the Russia-Ukraine conflict to World War I. Because of the static positions. But if you look at World War I, specifically on the Western Front, because if we were to look on the Southern Front and the Eastern Front, there's more action, there's more dramatic movement there. But specifically on the Western Front, what you basically see is that there is very minimal movement by both sides from 1914 to about, the first half of 1918. Both sides occasionally, try to attempt to offenses, but it ends up turning into these meat grinder battles that don't really move the ball significantly one way or the other. But at a certain point, Germany suffers a certain critical mass of damage, and the whole thing just comes undone.
Yep.
Now, to be fair, they also had the Allies had fresh reserves in the form of the U.S. military, but again, I don't think that the manpower discrepancy is in Ukraine's favor in this case, unless NATO joins the fight.
Yeah, no, I mean, Ukraine is definitely on the losing side of the correlation of forces. Russia has all of the advantages. And even if NATO gets involved, I always hear people talk about that. With what? With what? What is NATO going to bring to the table? How many French soldiers can actually be deployed out of France into Ukraine? Remember logistics? I talked about logistical sustainability. There's only a handful of militaries today that can fight large-scale ground combat. In fact, in Europe, there's only 3. One is the United States, one is Russia, and the other one's Ukraine. There's no European army today that can fight large-scale ground combat because they're not trained for it, they're not equipped for it, there's no sustainability. What is France going to bring to Ukraine? A few thousand troops? A few thousand troops. They'll all be dead in a month. They can't sustain it. When they deploy air power forward, we're talking about, a half a dozen of aircraft in a permissive environment. Those aircraft won't exist. The pilots won't exist. You don't simply move airplanes from a French base to a base in Poland or a base in Romania. You have to bring logistics forward, which means now you have to logistical sustainability, a supply line. France has no ability to do this. Germany has no ability. Germany, what? They're going to build the largest ground army in Europe, they say. They're going to relive their Nazi past. But a recent poll showed that if Germany was invaded, only 16% of the German men would be willing to fight and die for their country. 16% if Germany was invaded. What is that number going to be if Germany decides to take the fight abroad, to invade somebody else? How many Germans are willing to fight and die in that war? None. Great Britain, you can take the totality of the British military, put it in a large soccer stadium. I think you have a couple here in Moscow, and have 30,000 unsold seats. It's just a non-existent military. The Polish military runs out of ammunition in 14 days. They don't have the ability to take their troops out of garrison and put them in the field. Russia and Ukraine have deployed, hundreds of thousands of men in a very intense combat environment, and they logistically sustain this effort. The United States has the unique capacity to deploy hundreds of thousands of troops around the world and sustain them logistically. No other nation can do that. China can't do it. Nobody can do it. And so what is Europe talking about when they say they're going to intervene? Europe doesn't have the capacity to do this. And to develop the capacity will cost hundreds of billions of euros that Europe simply doesn't have. Where's the industrial capacity to equip this military? Rheinmetall, who builds the Leopard tanks and other things, 20% decline in their stock value. Germany's economy is collapsing. Deindustrialization is taking place. Where's France going to get the tires to put on these vehicles? Michelin's out of business. So I just think that Europe's a lot of huffing and puffing, but they can't blow the house down.
Returning to the Ukrainian military capabilities, though, before the interview, I was, rereading my Clausewitz, and, he has the idea of the culminating point of attack, at which, point the offensive side begins to lose gas. That got me thinking, surely that means that there's an inverse, the culminating point of defense.
Correct.
At which point the defensive side, regardless of how committed, how effective they've been, start to also crack.
Yep.
I guess, is the Ukrainian military beginning to approach this culminating point of defense? And what are the potential signs that we would need to look for to test this thesis?
Well, again, let's draw upon history. In this case, we can draw upon American history, the American Civil War. After the Battle of Gettysburg, the Army of Northern Virginia withdrew back to Virginia from their Pennsylvania adventure, and the Army of the Potomac regrouped. General Grant took command, and from 1863 to 1864 to 1865, they fought a war of attrition. The Army of Potomac engaging the Army of Northern Virginia. The Army of Northern Virginia inflicted tremendous casualties on the Army of the Potomac, but they also suffered casualties. The Army of the Potomac could replace their losses and continue to put pressure. The Army of Northern Virginia, although they had good leaders and good fighting men, became weaker and weaker and weaker, less and less flexibility. And eventually, at the end of the day, the Army of Northern Virginia was unable to match the combined efforts of the Army of the Potomac. They overwhelmed them. They collapsed. The culminating point of defense was reached, where the Confederate forces lost the ability to retain cohesion. Gaps started to appear. The Army of the Potomac was able to exploit these gaps, forcing the enemy into a constant state of retreat because they were unable to build defensive cohesion. So what we're looking for is the depletion of military manpower. And we're seeing that. I believe that the combined effect of Pokrovsk and Kupiansk will be to rip 10,000 or more highly trained Ukrainian forces from the order of battle. They're gone. There's nothing to replace them. In order to replace them, you're going to have to withdraw troops from the Volchansk area in Kharkov, or bring them out of Zaporozhye, out of Kherson in reserve. And when you do that...
And it's worth noting that on the Zaporozhye front, the Russians are starting to prick there near an important logistical point called Gulay Polya.
Yep.
Again, that name probably doesn't say much, but it's one of the key arteries, for example, connecting the Zaporozhye region to Donetsk.
100%. And but this is what's happening because the Russians have been beating their head against a brick wall in the Zaporozhye region for some time now. It's been very difficult fighting, not a lot of movement. But now what's happening is, because of the pressure that Russia places on the totality of the battlefield, the Ukrainians have been having to move forces in, thinning their lines. And then Russia now, by keeping the pressure on, starts to exploit gaps. And the Ukrainians start to withdraw, and they're going to lose this important logistical hub. And when they lose that, again, they run into another problem. What's behind them? When you lose a logistical hub, you lose the ability to sustain the fight. Again, I go back to just basic principles. Logistical sustainability is what wins and loses wars. And the Ukrainians are about to lose a logistical hub in Pokrovsk. They're going to lose one in Zaporozhye. And at that point in time...
And in Kupiansk as well.
In Kupiansk and others. The other thing, if you look at the battlefield, you see these big pincer movements that have created these cauldrons in Pokrovsk and Kupiansk. And these have been, the Russians have been methodically building this capability through, constant military action. But if you expand the map and look all up and down the line, you see similar things where the Ukrainians have a strong point and the Russians are just moving to outflank it. Now, traditionally, the Russians leave an escape route so that the Ukrainian forces can pull back. But what we're now seeing is that the Russians are changing their tactics. Sadly, they're trying to kill as many Ukrainians as possible because they realize that the Ukrainians have reached this culminating point on defensive operations. And right now, as the logistical capacity to sustain the fight is combined with the manpower shortage, you're going to see a comprehensive collapse of the front line. The Russians are in the business of killing Ukrainians, and right now the business is very good.
Again, I do want to, play devil's advocate. That, obviously, the Ukrainians have a lot of problems. But, for example, in the Donetsk region, they still have the fortress cities of Kramatorsk and Slaviansk, which have been, they're the last two remaining Ukrainian fortress cities, and they're arguably the most fortified. You look in Sumy region, again, the Ukrainians are trying hard to stop the Russians from building a big, beautiful buffer zone in the north. Kharkov, no matter what happens, it's a city with 2 million people, so cracking that nut would be difficult. And when it comes to Zaporozhye, just as the Russians have been able to build up defenses there, the Ukrainians have been able to build up defenses there. And we haven't even gotten to Kherson, because if to liberate Kherson, you would have to cross the Dnipro River. And crossing rivers is always a logistical big challenge. So I think that you are correct. I do, however, try and check myself and check my own sort of preferences. And it seems that the Ukrainians still have enough cards to play to be in the fight for at least another year.
War is an extension of politics by other means. You've read your Clausewitz.
Yeah.
Okay. So if you want to look at it purely from a military perspective, I think you could make that case that the collapse that Russia anticipates, this culminating point of the failure to retain defensive cohesion, may be held off for a period of time. Maybe Ukraine can fight on into the spring and into the summer and into the fall of next year. Maybe. But what backs the military? An economy that's non-functioning. Zero economic activity. Ukraine requires 100% donations from the West. The United States is out of the donation business. So it falls fully upon the Europeans to sustain Ukraine. In an act of desperation, the Ukrainians have been saying we need to have access to the $100 or so billion that has been frozen, seized in Belgian banks. But there's pushback. I mean, the people that do that say, if you do this, we're going to lose the credibility of the institution. People will pull their money out, and this will lead to a total financial collapse of not just Europe, but the world. So it's a pipe dream that Ukraine's going to gain access to these hundreds of billions of dollars of illegally frozen Russian assets. So now where's the money going to come from? From the thriving European economy? I mean, France just suffered multiple governmental failures because of their inability to pass a budget, because they simply don't have any money. And yet, France is now going to also underwrite Ukraine. You need $120 billion to do this. Where's that money coming from? It doesn't exist. And so we're looking at the financial collapse of Ukraine. Combine that financial collapse with the ongoing corruption reality that can no longer be swept under the rug. The justice minister and the minister of, the economics minister, $100 million corruption scandal. It's admitted now. They're fleeing the country. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. Now the West is going to further unravel the reality of Ukraine's corruption, and it's going to become politically difficult, if not impossible, to continue to feed resources that are desperately needed by the European people who are losing their pensions, losing their vacations, losing everything, their health care, because of the lunatic policies of their politicians who say it's okay for you to suffer as long as we keep Ukraine viable. That's a losing proposition politically. And so, the Zelensky government's on a razor's edge. Right now, there's a lot of movement going on. I guess there's some talk about Andrei Yermak, leaving the president's administration. People need to understand the reality of Ukraine. It's not that Yermak works for Zelensky. Yermak is the head of a competing power structure within Ukraine, the presidential administration, which makes policy in its own right. And yet Yermak is risk of being moved. They're talking about moving him to London to get him out of the country. We're looking at a political freefall, economic freefall. And when you have that happen, what happens to Ukrainian society? Because what is the military fighting for? They're fighting for their homeland, which means they're fighting for their families. They're fighting for, their legacy. And if you have societal collapse, then there's nothing to fight for. There's no motivation to fight for. So yes, the Ukrainian military, I already said, hats off to them. I hate them. I hate their Nazi affiliations. I despise the fact that they sing songs to step on Bandera. I view them all as rapists and murderers, given the precedent of what happened in Kursk. But they can fight like hell. So give them full credit. But that does not make war. War is an extension of politics by other means. And the rest of the factors that contribute to this, the economic factors, the political factors, the societal factors, they're all in a free fall situation, and that will hasten. And what's making this even worse for Ukraine is the strategic air campaign that Russia's waging right now, destroying Ukraine's capacity to generate electricity, to generate heat in a winter that's coming. I've been out on the streets of Moscow. It's pretty damn cold, and it's going to get colder. And I can guarantee it's going to be cold in Ukraine. It's going to be a very long winter. And if the Ukrainian people can't be heated, if they can't be fed, if they can't be given hope, that societal collapse will happen even quicker.
I think that people are going to be annoyed at me for saying this, but when I think about the Russia-Ukraine conflict, I think the best analogy from Hollywood that I could choose are the Rocky movies, with Russia as Rocky Balboa. And Rocky doesn't do Mike Tyson-style knockouts. He gets into these long, grinding slugfest where he delivers damage, he absorbs damage, but he ultimately out-perseveres his opponent. That's why he ends up winning in the last round, because he, unlike his opponent, has the ability to grind it out. And again, I think that people right now expect, flashy beat-up sessions, flashy knockout sessions. But successful war takes in different forms. And right now it seems that Russia is trying to go for a death by 1,000 cuts rather than trying to go for a costly knockout blow.
Yeah, I'm not a professional fighter, but I've boxed. Mainly for cardio. I'm an old fat man and I have to try and get in shape somehow. But one of the things I learned about boxing is that if you have two qualified boxers, the guy that tries to throw the knockout blow actually opens himself up for a counter punch. So if you're trying to deliver the knockout blow, it's actually more likely you'll be knocked out because the enemy will exploit a moment of vulnerability. Whereas the best strategy is just to grind away, come in, throw the body punches, get those arms to drop, hit them in the shoulders, get the arms to drop, and force them back, keep them off balance. And I think that's what the Russians are doing right now. This is a very smart fight that they're fighting because their opponent does have the ability to deliver a knockout blow. And you have to avoid that. You have to avoid making the mistake. Russia has the ability to deliver a knockout blow too. But the maturity, this is like having a good trainer in the corner. No, Rocky, don't throw the punch, Rocky. Hit the body, don't throw the knockout punch. You need a good trainer. And Russia has good trainers from Vladimir Putin on down. Patience, perseverance. I think your analogy is a good analogy. I don't know if the Russians are going to like that though, because Rocky Balboa, of course, was an American, and it was Ivan Drago who, was the Russian fighter. But I get what you're saying.
We started with Venezuela. We ended with Rocky Balboa. I think that, this conversation can't go any better. So I think we should end on a high note. Scott, thank you so much for joining us. And thank you to all of you who tuned in and watched. If you enjoyed this video, please help us out by liking it, by reposting it if you think anyone else would benefit from it. And if you want to get more in-depth geopolitical analysis from a multipolar perspective, make sure to follow New Rules Geopolitics on X and on Telegram. Thank you all for tuning in. Till next time.